You wake up strapped to a table. There's a goat in the room. A man enters, but instead of weapons, he carries a bowl of salt water. He soaks your feet and waits. The goat steps closer and starts licking. You laugh at first, until your body starts convulsing. Laughter turns into pain, and then into something far worse. For thousands of years, humanity has explored one of its darkest obsessions: torture. From the Roman Empire's rat cages to the Spanish Inquisition's Iron Maiden, from molten lead and electric shocks to forced suffocation and flaying, the tools may change, but the cruelty remains the same. In today's episode, we'll journey through some of the most brutal and bizarre methods of torture and execution ever devised, and what they reveal about us. But first, as always, viewer discretion is advised. We tend to think tortures were typical of the Middle Ages and Inquisition, but the executioners of that era had enough sources to draw inspiration from. For example, ancient Romans carried out tortures using rats. Just imagine, you are lying on your back with your arms and legs tied up and a cage full of giant rats is put on your stomach. The executioner throws burning coals on the cage so that it starts heating up. The rats run around their prison squeaking, but there's no chance to get away from the heat. So they start digging a tunnel through your belly. They bite your skin and muscles and rip your bowels apart, making you go crazy with pain. And as if that wasn't enough, here's the cherry on top. The executioner places the burning coals right into the opened wound on your stomach. This torture has several variations. Sometimes the cage with rats was put on a person's head. Sometimes prisoners were simply locked in a room, swarming with hungry rodents. But medieval executioners were worthy successors to ancient Romans. Just take a look at this lead sprinkler. It was filled with molten lead, boiling oil, resin, and even acid. Then the executioner sprayed the liquid all over the victim's naked body. The hot molten lead left severe burns on the skin. To make the suffering even worse, the executioner could pour the boiling liquid on the person's eyes or mucosa. But some really dreadful forms of torture don't even require weird instruments. A Colombian necktie was a popular means of punishment among drug lords in the 50s. Sometimes this invention is attributed to famous drug trafficker Pablo Escobar. But in fact, the Colombian necktie already gained popularity when Escobar was only a child. Let's see what it is. At first, the victim had to be immobilized. Then their neck was cut. While the person was choking on their blood, the executioner stuck their fingers in the wound and pulled the tongue out. If the cut on the neck was vertical, that was a Colombian necktie. If it was horizontal, you had a Colombian necklace. But why did they need to invent such a sophisticated punishment when there's a way to torture someone simply and agonizingly long? Oubliettes are bottle dungeons that were built in medieval castles with one purpose in mind: to hold prisoners. These cells were usually narrow and very deep. Executioners threw victims to the bottom and closed the hatch. Inside an oubliette, there was no place to lie down or even sit. Imagine that you have to stand and can't move a muscle. Hours and days pass, followed by weeks. You can see an exit just a couple of meters away, but there's no way you can reach it. You can only feel a searing pain in your stiff body and intolerable hunger. Sometimes spikes were placed on the floor of oubliettes to increase the victim's physical suffering even more. The most frequent guests of these dungeons were captive soldiers, and they stayed there forever. Medieval people were big fans of slow tortures. But it wasn't necessary to dig whole underground dungeons to turn someone's life into hell. Sometimes all it took was a fork. The medieval Inquisition used a heretic's fork to torture those who practiced the so-called wrong religion. A two-pronged fork was attached to the wearer's throat, with one prong pointing at the chin and the other just above the sternum. The prisoner had to constantly keep their head tilted back. A couple of hours spent in that position brought terrible pain to the neck. But as soon as the victim tried to lower his head, the sharp prongs impaled soft tissues beneath the chin. Some victims attempted to end their suffering once and for all by sharply bringing their heads down, but only made things worse. They didn't die, but continued to bleed as their bodies racked with even more horrible pain. However, cruel, lingering tortures didn't go down in history together with the Middle Ages. In the 60s, in an Arkansas state prison, resident physician Dr. Rollins decided that prisoners weren't punished quite enough. Together with the prison superintendent, they developed the Tucker telephone. An inmate was brought into a hospital chamber. One electrode was attached to their big toe and another to their genitals. Then the physician cranked the handle of the telephone, which delivered electric shocks to the victim's body. But long-distance calls were the absolute worst. During them, several prolonged shocks passed through the inmate until the person lost consciousness. And although this method is utterly sadistic, sometimes executioners went even further. These are crocodile shears, a medieval instrument designed for especially brutal torture. It was heated in a fire and then applied to the victim's genitals and clamped shut. This punishment was reserved for the men who tried to assassinate the king. There also was a similar torture instrument made for women. The iron spider was used to rip the breasts from wives accused of adultery. Equipped with 4 iron claws, the device was heated up, and then the woman's breasts were fixed onto the claws. They were sharply pulled and literally tore the soft parts off. The victim was bleeding out, and even if she survived, she could still easily die later from all sorts of infections. But don't think these inhumane punishments for misdeeds were only common in the Middle Ages. Until the mid-19th century, in the Russian Empire, guilty soldiers were forced to run the gauntlet. The other soldiers were lined up in 2 rows on both sides of the road, forming a corridor, each of them armed with a pike, a whip, or a club. The victim was stripped from neck to waist and ordered to pass between the double row while his comrades were hitting him from both sides. The severity of the punishment differed depending on the severity of the misconduct. For instance, alcohol abuse led up to 500 blows, while a soldier who'd attempted to escape got up to 5,000. But sometimes, the torture became a full-scale public execution. The victim was forced to run the gauntlet back and forth again, and again, until he fell to the ground from exhaustion. While the soldier was still alive, his body was put on a sled or carriage, which was sent through the rows as many times as the man needed to finally stop breathing. But the most horrifying part is that running the gauntlet doesn't even rank among the top 3 most brutal torments created by humans. Flaying is one of the oldest forms of tortures in history. Assyrians practiced it around 800 years BC. The executioner usually took a sharp knife and made a cut on the victim's shin and hips, then flayed off the skin piece by piece. Sometimes the body was hung up on a hook for convenience, or even impaled. When the whole thing was over, the person was left to slowly die. In most cases, they passed away within a few hours of blood loss or pain shock. But there were occasions when the victim was less fortunate and spent another few days in terrible agony, slowly dying of hypothermia and infections, a frightening end of life. But medieval executions outdid even the creators of flaying. A rack is a device consisting of a wooden frame with rollers on both ends. The victim's ankles and wrists were fastened to it, and then the executioner rotated the rollers. This pulled the muscles and joints to the point of causing excruciating pain. The person tortured on the rack ended up with countless dislocations, and their muscles stretched so much that they couldn't contract anymore. And as if there could still be any pain tolerance left, the executioner could also burn the victim's flanks with torches or slide hot coal between their adjacent toes, or simply take pincers and tear out the nails. But the worst thing that the rack torture produced was the sound, the snap of the cartilage getting ruptured, ligaments getting torn, and bones getting broken. Sometimes other prisoners were brought to watch the process, and after they did, they quickly confessed to all their crimes. You may think this is it. There can't be anything worse than this torment. But wait until you learn about necklacing, which was popular in South Africa in the 80s. The victims who had to undergo necklacing were primarily criminals and illegal immigrants. Imagine that an angry crowd gathers around you. Your hands are tied behind the back with barbed wire, and on top of that, a rubber tire crushes your ribcage. The next thing you know is that the crowd drenches you with gasoline. Then, the next thing you hear is a cigarette lighter click. A few moments later, a searing pain swallows you completely. Under high temperatures, the tire starts melting and sticking to the skin. You'll stay conscious for only about 20 minutes, burning alive in the molten rubber. Your body will keep smoldering and turning into charred remains for many hours after you actually die. But torture didn't end with fire and chains because Inquisition-era Europe had its own terrifying inventions. Imagine an iron sarcophagus, covered with sharp spikes on the inside. A person is locked inside in a standing position, and they are slowly bleeding to death. That is the Iron Maiden, the classics of the medieval Inquisition. So, you've been accused of heresy and required to sign a confession. Of course, you're refusing. Then the executioner opens the door of the Iron Maiden and invites you in. What's going on with the person inside the sarcophagus? It's not a big deal at first. Spikes can damage the skin a little bit, that's all. But after spending half an hour in the same position, you'll want to move. In a few hours more, your legs will start to get tired, and your nose will most likely start to itch. After 20 hours in the Iron Maiden without food or water, you'll start losing consciousness from exhaustion and blood loss. But as soon as you pass out, you'll feel a sharp pain from dozens of spikes. It'll bring you to your senses, but not for long. You'll pass out and wake up from pain again and again and again. Are you ready to confess to heresy already? Take your time, because torturing wasn't invented in the Middle Ages. The executioners of that time were inspired by ancient China. In the 200s BC, tickle torture was first used in China. It turned out to be so effective that it lasted for over 2,000 years. It has many variations, but the most popular one looks like this. A person is tied to a table and their heels are wetted with salt solution. Then, they let the goat come in the room. The animal is licking the salt off your heels and just tickling you. For the first couple of minutes, it'll be even kind of fun. But imagine that you keep getting tickled for an hour, then 2, then 3. On your foot, there are about 200,000 nerve endings. From their constant irritation, even a slight touch to the heel will cause a twitch, uncontrollable laughter, and sharp pain. A way too long tickle torture can lead to a respiratory muscle spasm, and you'll literally suffocate to death with laughter. Another unusual torture that nomads loved very much was shearing. With its help, prisoners were turned into obedient slaves. First, your head is shaved until it's completely smooth. Then, fresh piece of camel skin is taken and put on like a hat. So far, it sounds disgusting, but still tolerable. The worst is yet to come. Your hands will be tied in a special stick structure that won't let you take this hat off. Then you will be left out for about 5 days in the middle of the desert. The camel skin, when exposed to the sun, will start to shrink and tighten the skull. After a while, the hair on the head will begin to grow back, but it will not be able to get through the shearing and will grow in. But executioners did not always have to leave a person alive. It's time to tell you about the deadliest tortures in history. For this purpose, let's go back to ancient China. But this time, not to the torture basement, but to the bamboo grove. We'll need ropes to hang a person parallel to the ground, and a knife to sharpen bamboo shoots. Bamboo grows very fast, up to 1 meter per day. They just hang you over such a patch and wait a few days. And its stems are strong enough to pass through the human body. Bamboo will now haunt my dreams. But you don't think this is the most painful torture, do you? Remember when the Inquisition locked you up in the Iron Maiden? In ancient Rome, the copper bull was used instead. There's not much room inside, so you'll have to lie bent over. But the uncomfortable position is the last thing you'll be thinking about. As soon as the door on the copper bull's belly closes, they'll start making a fire underneath it. The only chance for salvation is to kick down the door and escape. But doing it in a narrow, overheated bull's belly won't be easy. It'll take years of training to thrust it down with your hand. It will be more effective to keep slamming the door with your feet. You're probably not the first person to be roasted in that bull, and the lock has been damaged before you. A few kicks, and you're free. No documented cases of execution by growing bamboo or the copper bull torture have been found by scientists. They were probably just legends that were used to intimidate people. But the next torture I'm going to tell you about is extensively described in documents. For you to be sentenced to execution by elephants, it was enough to be late on taxes. Execution elephants were trained not to kill a person immediately, but first to crush and rip off their arms and legs. In India, such executions were arranged as big spectacles. Do you think there's any way you can escape the giant legs of the animal weighing 4 tons? You can try to keep your arms and legs to your side and roll over on the ground, but there's a possibility that the elephant will step on you by accident. Or you can call your elephant and order it to crush the executioner, who gives orders to the killer elephant. But one more giant animal in the arena is unlikely to increase your chances of survival. From cages filled with rats to fire-heated bulls, from suffocating dungeons to the crushing weight of elephants. The history of torture is a reminder of how far human cruelty can go when it's given purpose, power, or spectacle. And yet what's most disturbing isn't that these methods existed centuries ago, but that echoes of them still surface in our own time. Pain, humiliation, and fear remain tools in the hands of those who seek control. So ask yourself, which is worse? The horrors of the past that scarred bodies forever, or the possibility that people today could still find new ways to do the same? If you've made it this far, let me know in the comments which method shocked you the most. And don't forget to subscribe for more shocking real-life stories that prove that the darkest torture chamber is the human imagination.